So for us to get a sense of proportion here, I typically like to do a little historical perspective so we can understand the arena within which the current ideas, modern ideas, exist. And I want to tell you what, my brain is not firing to save my life, so if I sound drunk, I'm not. So anyway, I'm struggling. Anyway, here we go. So prior to America, there was no prosperity to observe save the extraordinary lifestyles of kings and princes and rulers and their patrons. For the most part, the rest of society, 99% of the rest of society, lived a day or two away from starvation. Now, practically, this meant for the church that Jesus' charge in Matthew 5 and Luke 4, the Sermon on the Mount, was taken to mean feeding the poor, or blessed are the poor. This was a metaphorical assertion. It wasn't a here and now assertion because there was nothing to feed anybody with. It wasn't like you had extra in your kitchen. It's not like Americans now with these big refrigerators stocked full of food. No, by the way, your neighbors could use a meal or two. Nobody had anything. Everybody was going to starve to death if they didn't eat what they had. And Jesus was using a metaphor to describe salvation of a spiritual poverty or a spiritual oppression. It wasn't practical real world. No one could conceive of a world where there might have been enough left over to feed the poor because they could barely feed themselves. So Jesus couldn't possibly have been talking about something you should actually do. The singular social justice from before the 1st century until the 19th century was overthrowing thugs and tyrants who taxed their serfs and waged war to pillage someone else's serfs. For the bulk of human history, the biggest challenge that men had was man's specific relationship, specific government relationship. Governments were tyrannies, and everybody else suffered under their tyranny. So fixing that was the central theme of pretty much all of our political evolutions. So the relationship between the church and thugs went like this. It's God's will to wage war. War ravages the people. Then the church tells the very thugs that created the ravages they should give the poor or go to hell, and then the church would say, hey, it's God's will to wage war. So you have this vicious, endless cycle and this marrying of mystic despotism with tyranny. The church finds its relevance in its association with the political state, the force of government, and then it justifies its existence by telling the state how to act. And in most instances, the state wanted to know, hey, can I go kill those other people for their stuff? And if I'm morally okay to do that, will God tell me I'm morally okay to do that? Now, there's kind of one caveat on this, give to the poor, go to hell. It really ended up being, give to us, we'll give it to the poor so you don't go to hell. Which is why the Catholic Church ended up being so exceedingly wealthy. All that capital was given to the church. And it wasn't actually distributed to all the people. It was a cozy relationship as long as it lasted. And it's hard to argue with it because there was nothing with which to compare. And then happened, and then this happened. Capitalism equals liberty, or liberty equals capitalism. Along came America, and the jig was up. Suddenly, wealth and prosperity, the true origin of wealth and prosperity became apparent. The true origin of wealth and prosperity is individual production, and specifically under specific social and political circumstance, peace and freedom. So government that doesn't pillage and plunder, that doesn't wage war, that defends the individual so they can produce, and suddenly we go from barely being able to feed ourselves to more abundance than we could ever have imagined. The poverty machine called war was shown for the fraud that it was, as were the mystic despots that were in bed with the war machine. And within 100 years, free individuals willingly trading with other men created levels of wealth kings had rarely conceived. In the 21st century, I guarantee you, 99.9% of the population now lives better than most kings could ever have dreamed of. And our poor, particularly in America and in the Western world, are still wealthier than the rest of the world by large margins. Our poor still carry cell phones.
Yeah.
And they're on food stamps.
Huh?
And they're on food stamps.
Oh, and they're on food stamps. Yeah.
But that's so they can afford the cell phone.
And so this is what really happened. Not only does capitalism equal liberty, and liberty equals capitalism, capitalism destroyed the cozy relationship between mystic despots, between preachers and tyrants. Because the validation the church had was in the consecration of government force. And the government force was used in defense of the religious mystic despot. Suddenly, if the church is no longer in the business of being in bed with government, and it can't extort people in government for doing what it wants, what then is its purpose? Suddenly we have the United States of America. The separation of the church state from the secular state, giving individuals freedom and liberty independent of a religious orthodoxy, showed that what the church was really all about. And that was its fundamental cog in the wheel of tyranny. But never fear, because the church is amazingly adept at finding a political host. And now we get to the church in the modern age. This new host is the current push to join the global socialist movement. And once again, every greedy, envious preacher has their eyes focused on a wealth they could not create, nor could they conceive. It is the wealth of free men. Now they have seen the money. Now they have money really to consider. Remember, first century, there was no wealth and there was no prosperity, so they listen to Jesus' words, and in their mind is no practical application. But now in the modern age, hey, there's wealth here. Now what does Matthew 5 and Luke 4 actually mean? If we're going to proclaim good news to the poor, what does that mean? If we're going to set at liberty those who are oppressed, what does that mean? Is it still just a spiritual bromide? Oh no, it's not. Now it is a mandate for the here and now. And those who are persecuted for thirsting for righteousness are really people suffering in the fight, literally, the forcible fight, to produce the correct moral outcome. Specifically, taking money from those who have it and giving it to other people. Now, you might be saying, John, that's just fanciful liberation theology. That's just an extension on the truth. It's not really what God was talking about. Well, okay. This is John Calvin from the Institutes. I'm going to give you a second to read what's there, and then I'll read it to you. So here's what John Calvin said. I say that not only they who labor for the defense of the gospel, but they who in any way maintain the cause of righteousness suffer persecutions for righteousness. Therefore, whether in declaring God's truth against Satan's falsehoods, or in taking up the protection of the good and innocent against the wrongs of the wicked, we must undergo the offenses and hatreds of the world, which may imperil either our lives, our fortunes, or our honor. let's back up a tick and talk about the biblical, quote-unquote, logic behind the secularist, the socialist movement. Among a few passages that are used to justify the collectivist culture is Acts 4. I'll let you read briefly. Acts 4, 32 through 35, this is the ESV. Isn't that the chosen Calvinist version?
Yeah.
I did that on purpose, just so they felt right at home. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own. But they had everything in common, and with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds that was sold, and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed, each as they had need. The logic is, since apostles were led by the Spirit to hold all things in common, the communal life must be God's ideal social organization. And now I'm going to point out this is exactly how this web of tyranny starts to build. What do we have? We have this divine ideal. We're going to hold all things in common. And this all holding things in common is the utopian ideal. The problem is, what happens when people don't want to sell their stuff and give it away?
They kind of missed the part where people kind of did that on their own.
Yeah, there is that part, right? And oh, by the way, they abandoned it almost immediately. You never see that reproduced in the Book of Acts.
And that was also, they kind of also leave out the part where that wasn't a social construct, that was a familial construct because we were members of God's family, because this was a new thing. And they recognized that other members of their family were hurting because they were suffering for their faith, for their newfound faith. And they said, my brother is hurting, but I want to help, let's help him. You know, it's not that you had a bunch of lazy bums who weren't producing, and you had a bunch of achievers who were producing, and it wasn't fair that they were taking too much of their own share.
Well, and I will say, in the first century, wealth was not a byproduct of achievement. In the first century, almost always it was a byproduct of patronage. Now there was a worker class, if you will, of freemen who worked. Jesus being a carpenter being one of them. But most wealth was patronage. So if you had houses, if you had lands, it was because at some point some king somewhere stole it and then redistributed it. So it is not nearly the same social construct. And I deliberately picked the ESV because I didn't really want to do a translation comparison, but I want you to notice it's distributed as each as they have need. These are all modern concepts. So the logic is, since the apostles were led by the Spirit, they held all things in common, and communal life must be God's ideal social organization. But this never produces utopia. This social structure has been advocated and tried over and over in the church, even though it has died just a slow or quick death in every instance. Probably one of the best examples is the Puritans. Rush Limbaugh has every Thanksgiving gives his little mini speech on the Puritans discovering capitalism. And while on some level it's true, it didn't happen overnight. It took 5 years. And it almost killed them. Their socialist construction, their communal construction, it took 5 years before they ever got wise enough to figure out they were about ready to starve to death. Actually, they had been starving to death. And so it took them, it was a hard lesson for them to learn, to figure out that individual initiative fed them much better than this whole communal living business. But this fundamental failure has never deterred true mystics in their hold on, because they hold reality in contempt. Now I want to talk to you about the two swords doctrine. And we have talked abundantly and relentlessly in these conferences about the new Calvinists, the mystic despots, and their absolute hatred for reality as such. Now, the two swords doctrine, some of you are probably familiar with it, particularly if you've had any association with the Catholic Church. This doctrine has been around pretty much from the inception of Christianity. And this is the premise, and it's actually based on this vague comment in the Gospels, and they said, "Look, Lord, here are two swords," and he said to them, "It is enough." Now, this gets extrapolated in the allegorical interpretive methodology that you mentioned with Origen. That allegorical interpretive methodology lasted for the bulk of the Dark Ages, so it was not uncommon. And so what they did is they allegorized the two swords, and they said that church authorities had dominion. There are two fundamental spheres of influence, and one was the heavenly realm, and the other one was the earthly temporal realm. So this is the spiritual eternal, and this is the earthly fleshly temporal. And so now the Catholic Church has claimed total dominance over both, which is why they were the dominant political and religious force throughout the Middle and Dark Ages, or Dark and Middle Ages and High Middle Ages. But this mindset, so you might be saying to me, "Well, John, but that's the Catholics. That's not actually Protestant doctrine." You're sure about that, are you? Got to find my own comments here. Bear with me. So here is the Institutes. This is an extended passage. I'm going to let you read it first, and then I will chime in. Can you shut that door, please? Can you shut that door, please? I can hear them talking. So I'm going to read for those who are watching online. Maybe you can't see this. It's pretty small type. So this is Institutes. This is Calvin's Institutes 3:19-14. Therefore, in order that none of us may stumble upon the stone, let us first consider that there is a twofold government in man. One aspect is spiritual, thereby the conscience is instructed in piety and reverence in God. The second is political, whereby man is educated for the duties of humanity and citizenship that must be maintained among men. These are usually called the spiritual and the temporal jurisdiction, by which is meant that the former sort of government pertains to the life and soul, while the latter has to do with the concerns of the present life. Not only with food and clothing, but with laying down laws whereby a man may live his life among other men, wholly, honorably, and temporally. For the former resides in the inner mind, while the latter regulates only outward behavior. The one may call the spiritual kingdom, the other the political kingdom. Now, this bold is my emphasis. It says, now these two, as we have divided them, must always be examined separately. And while one is being considered, we must call away and turn aside the mind from thinking of the other. There are in man, so to speak, two worlds over which different kings and different laws have authority. This is Calvin's, one of many passages addressing this. This is Calvin's reiteration of the two kingdoms doctrine. He is advocating exactly the same Catholic position. Now, this doctrine has existed, like I said, from the beginning with Augustine and his City of God. He was the first one to propose formally propose this dividing line. And you do flash forward in history, Martin Luther, in some of his early writings, it's a little murky, but he is advancing a two kingdoms kind of concept. One of his challenges was, and this was unique, an intellectual challenge to him, he is trying to figure out how to justify unseating papal authority in a largely layman's movement in the Reformation. Now, while Martin Luther was, he was considered part of the structure of the Catholic Church, he never really thought he left it. But yet he doesn't really have any kind of authority to make the Catholic Church change its mind or change its doctrine. And so if he goes too far and says, hey, these two spiritual worlds exist, and the spiritual world doesn't have any impact over the temporal world, well, who has the force to be able to compel the Catholic Church to change? So he had some intellectual challenges in trying to figure out how to make this case. And he didn't do a particularly good job of it. John Calvin, on the other hand, decides to take this on full force because he recognizes that if there is not a way to justify this dual relationship between this ethereal spiritual space and this earthly temporal space, that they have a problem. Now, he has an endless hedge. You're going to see this consistently, and it's this one. I think it's fascinating right here. These must always be examined separately. He's trying to pretend that they are two distinct spheres, but I'm going to ultimately contend this is a distinction without a difference, and you'll know why. You'll understand why here in a minute. So this translates his work here. It translates into, there are two kingdoms. There's Kingdom A and Kingdom B. Kingdom A has a set of laws that apply to a world no one can see, feel, taste, or touch. Kingdom B has laws that apply to what people see, feel, taste, and touch, but people struggle to obey those laws, so they need help. Kingdom A's laws are more important than Kingdom B, but they can't really be applied. Indeed, we can't even consider them when discussing compelling people in Kingdom B to obey its laws. But we're not supposed to pay attention to the other kingdom. This is John Calvin's Jedi mind trick. These are not the droids you seek. He's trying to persuade you that this other kingdom has we can't really consider it, but it actually has jurisdiction over it. And it's confusing, right? Of course it is. It's designed to be confusing. This is Calvin's argumentation 101. And it's confusing because it is a deliberate and overt rejection of the law of identity. The moment you introduce a both-and proposition, when A and B can be exactly the same thing at the same time, oh, by the way, they're supposed to be separate at the same time, you have immediately introduced a contradiction into the discussion. I think formally this is called a dialectic. This is a both-and proposition, something that can be everything and nothing at the same time. Now, all mystic despots thrive on contradictions because that's what gives them so much power to rewrite reality. They must redefine reality to achieve their ends. And this is why grasping, at least understanding its existence, understanding the two-source doctrine is so important. Never forget that a kingdom is the jurisdiction of force consolidated under a king. Government is force. So when you talk to me about two kingdoms, you're really talking to me about two origins of force. And by setting up a transcendent kingdom, the proponents are advocating a transcendent right to force. So if a spiritual kingdom demands giving to the poor and the temporal kingdom is subordinate, then it is right that the temporal kingdom compel its members to give in the name of righteousness. And this is why I said the two-source doctrine is really a distinction without a difference. I don't care how much you try to hedge that we have a spiritual kingdom all concerned with spiritual things, and this temporal kingdom that's kind of concerned with all these lesser things. At the end, if the spiritual kingdom claims dominance, claims the right to define what is morally just, then they are also laying claim to the right to compel the temporal kingdom to act in accord with their will. And this is exactly what we've seen.
And then doesn't that kind of make the temporal kingdom kind of irrelevant?
It does. And this is exactly what we see throughout. The preacher says he governs in God's stead over some other kingdom, but practically he asserts dominion over every other kingdom because the other kingdom is sinful. I will let you read for a minute. the Calvin's Institutes 420:32. But in that obedience which we have shown to be due to the authority of rulers, we are always to make this exception. We are always to make this exception. We are always to make this exception. Indeed, to observe it as primary, that such obedience is never to lead us away from the obedience in Him, to whose will the desires of all ought to yield, to whose majesty's scepter ought to be submitted. And how absurd would it be that in satisfying men you should incur the displeasure from Him for whose sake you obey men. He has opened His sacred mouth, must alone be heard, before all and above all men. Next to Him we are subject to those men who are in authority over us, but only in Him. If they command anything against Him, let it go unesteemed. Translation, never mind what I said about the two kingdoms. Never shall they meet in discussion. It doesn't matter that I told you not to consider it. At the end of the day, the spiritual kingdom absolutely takes precedence, such that if the temporal kingdom ever commands anything that is against the spiritual kingdom, you should disregard it.
But then he just said that the spiritual kingdom demands that we obey the temporal kingdom.
Only in as much as the temporal kingdom is subordinate to the will of God. Only in that dimension. So the moment the temporal kingdom, in other words, I'll get here, hang on. So the logic continues. The preacher has spiritual dominion over Christians, but Christians live and work in a temporal society. The temporal society is corrupted by sin. This means that Christians should work and stand against a sinful society. So again, here we go. This is the utopia under discussion, right? This spiritual kingdom, this transcendent kingdom. Okay, but we live in a sinful world, in a fallen world. Mark that in your brain, fallen world. You're going to hear that again here in a few minutes. And what do we have in a fallen world? Well, we have incompetent masses. We have universal guilt. And by the way, what does Calvin suggest we must have? Dictated good. In other words, the ruler of the spiritual kingdom has the right to compel all these actions. Right? So why? So we can realize this spiritual kingdom.
I was just back there trying to find a couple books, and of course, when you need to find something, you can't find it. But this whole thing with two kingdoms is a doctrine that very few pastors in our day and very few churches in mainline evangelicalism would refute. It's one of the most common doctrines there are presently in the contemporary evangelical church.
Absolutely true. And it's one of those silent killers because it's presumed,
right,
and talked about as if, and no one ever says, "Well, wait a minute, what does that actually mean?"
Right. We've got a post on that on the blog, a short video of MacArthur teaching it. And just about the exact words that you're explaining it in.
So I will say, and to that point, what you will hear from the pulpit is almost universally some kind of hedge. The hedge falls very much in line with what John Calvin said previously. Christians can't press for the kingdom of God now. That would be politicizing the church. It would be a calling beneath the lofty utopian dream. They don't say that, but they say, well, it'd be a calling beneath, it'd be something beneath the dignity of the church to just be, somehow crassly political. Civil society can't be transformed in God's kingdom before Christ's return. There's an important distinction between spiritual righteousness and civil righteousness. So they hedge their bets. The problem is the practical outworking is exactly the opposite. While it's supposed to be beneath the dignity of the church, unless the church is in the business of transforming society, and you hear this out of the Gospel Coalition and most of the New Calvinists outlets right now often talk about transforming our culture.
Right.
So Calvin said that spiritual righteousness comes through the work of the Holy Spirit through the gospel. Spiritual righteousness is called to establish, but spiritual righteousness is called to establish civil righteousness. So the progression of force goes, spiritual righteousness gets to shape civil righteousness. Civil righteousness is merely the outward righteousness. Basically, you act right, but you're not really right. And I think Paul has done an outstanding job discussing the implications of progressive justification. So you can act moral, but you're not really possessing any moral action. You can go stand in the rain, but you don't really get to possess being wet. You've got it. Actually, you say it right better. Well, this gets to sound churchy, but the implications are vast. So as long as we just pretend that the church will only think good spiritual thoughts and mind their own business about civil society, we can all just get along, right? We can all live in a peaceful coexistence about spiritual things and about civil things. Wrong. Not so much. So these are two quotes out of Calvin's commentary on Psalms, one Psalm 72 and one Psalms 82. Please go ahead and read for me, and I'll comment here in a minute. So Calvin's commentary on Psalm 72 says, God takes a more special care of the poor than of others, since they are most exposed to injuries and violence. David, therefore, particularly mentions that the king will be the defender of those who can only be safe under the protection of the magistrate. Commentary on Psalms 82, a just and well-regulated government will be distinguished for maintaining the rights of the poor and afflicted. They are appointed to be the guardians of the poor, and that a special part of this duty lies in resisting the wrongs which are done to them, and repressing all unrighteous violence. Perfect righteousness would become triumphant through the world. Now, Calvin is now arguing that because we are made in the image of God, we are called to share our resources. This was a right, and the people were defrauded when a need was left unmet by those who had the ability to meet it. Caring for the poor isn't merely a charity, but a divine mandate at the heart of justice. Therefore, it is the civil government's responsibility to ensure that the poor receive their right. So for all the equivocation on the two swords doctrine, that church authority and secular authorities are independent realms, that they are out of sight, out of mind, Calvin's logic is, for Christ to be revealed in the church must perform justice. Justice is the rich giving to the poor. It is the deacon's job to make sure that civil government is doing justice. Therefore, it is church leadership's calling to conform civil government to the church's mission. Like I said, the two kingdoms doctrine is a distinction without a difference. It ends up being the logical consequence of when you actually create a dialectic, in other words, something that doesn't exist, something that supports the whole temporal world to its edict, you have no choice but to ultimately concede that it is the dominant force, the dominant right to govern in the earth. And like I said before, this is the historic outworking. Geneva, I know the neo-Calvinists always like to fuss that people bring up Geneva, but Geneva was John Calvin's brainchild. He put these political actions into action. And Geneva was a tyranny. Oliver Cromwell's England was a tyranny. The Massachusetts theocracy was a tyranny. So now we have to ask ourselves the question, if tyrannical outcomes have been in every instance where this body of ideas has been taken seriously and put into effect by men, tyranny and despotism has ruled, how then can you justify reproducing it over and over? And now I want to introduce you to history's necessary men. Now, for those of you who actually went out and successfully, I doubt, actually, no, I'd be very surprised if you got through my whole article today. But history's necessary men are words I took from the Nelson Mandela, Al Mohler article from 2013. He wrote an article right after Nelson Mandela died. It's, like I said, long article, currently out on Paul's Passing Thoughts. You read my full analysis there. But what he said there has direct bearing on what we're going to talk about today. Highlight summary is, during the eulogizing period over Mandela, everybody was slobbering over Mandela. Every pundit and thought leader had something to say, and since Al Mohler fancies himself a thought leader, which I think is funny. Al Mohler, thought leader, that's awesome.
Since you're kind of sagging into something else, I want to kind of stick this in.
Okay.
See if you think it's relevant. Page 79 of the Church Why. I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs here. The idea that God's kingdom is presently on earth is foundational to everything stated thus far. The church's view of the kingdom is a geyser spewing out a constant flow of falsehood and confusion. If God's kingdom is presently on earth, that speaks to authority. Like all kingdoms, we expect to see its infrastructure and institutions. This one idea produces the vast majority of rational inconsistency in the church, which itself gets a pass due to authority as truth. Unfortunately, this one idea makes Christianity just another political group among many. The world is a divided kingdom by nature. The world is defined by division, and the church has chosen to enter itself into the fray. In this age, God's kingdom is not on earth, and the ecclesia's mission is narrowly defined as opposed to the church, which must stick its nose in every human affair and issue.
Oh, you nailed it, bro.
Huh?
You nailed it.
Yeah.
That is the overarching political preoccupation.
Right.
But they're not honest about it. They like to pretend that it's somehow this lofty spiritual mission, when in actual fact, at the end of the day, particularly in the Neo-Calvinist movement, Al Mohler, he was a huge fan of Barack Obama. Most of them were heavily politically left and are advocating and advancing ideologies. And typically, and frankly, I think probably the only thing really preventing that side of the Christian world from going whole hog Democrat, politically leftist, is their position on abortion. And so that's some intellectual stopgap. But for the most part, as far as social structure, social organizations, socialist organization, central planning, those are all very leftist positions and very central themes within the Neo-Calvinist church.
And I think they're all in for leftist ideology, though they don't agree with it all, because they know that Americanism, if they ever have a prayer of getting back to the church state, Americanism must be destroyed at all costs. So really the only hope they have is to side with the left in destroying an Americanism and hope a church state comes out of the ashes.
And actually, I'll echo this a little later. That's where I'm concerned we're going.
Right.
Because I will say, politically left church leading, politically right church leaning, I'm concerned that we're headed for the secularized trend in our culture. I'm thinking will cause a counter movement. So fundamentally right now it's presumed, and I'm generalizing largely and I'm kind of riffing off the top of my head, But as of right this minute, the political left is largely identified by the Hollywood left. And that Hollywood left is seen as an amoral, immoral cesspool for lots of good reasons. And so that anti-morality, the anti-morality positions of the left, this is one of the reasons I think that the church is still kind of hesitant, is because they see that anti-morality as the source of chaos. And so, much like Oliver Cromwell trying to reestablish some form of societal order, believing that the root of that societal order is found in a very Christian morality, my concern is that what we're really going to see over the course of the next decades is as the chaos of this amorality spins out its cycle of out of control, we're going to end up with a reactionary movement that becomes very oppressive on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the political right and the political left hold the same fundamental premise, that the church is actually in charge of dictating government. So anyway, I'm a little ahead of myself, but I'm in agreement with what you just said there.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's get back to, well, so how do people justify an obvious social political disaster and a repeated failing social political disaster and bad things happening under the actions of sinful men? How do they justify that? How do they live with that? And it's very revealing what this article showed us from Al Mohler. Considering that everyone was slobbering over Mandela in 2013, I will say I was marginally impressed at Mohler's honest treatment of Mandela's life. Mandela was a Marxist terrorist, and Mohler didn't shy away from at least pointing out the reality. And since there is a global effort to rewrite global Marxism in its history, or maybe better said, there's a formal effort at a full-on historical reassignment surgery, Marxism and collectivism, they're trying to portray Marxism and collectivism as the historical ideal, as the human ideal. Capitalism and individuality is always the source of worldly evil. And how dare you disagree? Anyway, had Mohler's article focused on a rehash of Mandela's life, and then he's tried to shoehorn some pithy Christian statements, some Christian lesson into the article, it would have remained a total yarner. But there was a name dropped twice in that article that keyed in my mind, and that name was Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, I know most of you don't know Reinhold Niebuhr and don't care. I get it, I understand. I happen to like dusty theological books and have a degree in theology, and so I came across him in my early studies, but I remembered enough of Niebuhr's life and doctrine that I knew there was something important in Mohler's reference for Niebuhr. And his ideas, and Niebuhr's ideas, now remember, John Calvin, thought leader. And I want to introduce you to something that's very crucial to understand the evolution of ideas. This is the law of diffusion of innovation. And this is how all ideas new start and then expand through a culture. This is how products start and then expand through a culture. So for example, plasma television, here's the innovators, first 2%, right? Then you have your early adopters, that first 13 or so percent, that will buy a plasma television for $10,000 because they can. And then you have your early majority here, and they won't buy the plasma television for $10,000, but they'll buy it for $2,000. And there's a chasm here because it hits a natural resistance. The practicality versus the effectiveness of whatever it is expanding, it has to move over this chasm right around this first 34% mark. Now this group here will buy it, it's a product, it's actually starting to become more mainstream, and by the time it hits here, it's in Walmart, right? So this is how a technology moves. And the people back here, these laggers, these are the people that would still be using a rotary dial phone if they could buy one, right? They're never going to change, not going to happen, I don't care what you do, there's no way to persuade them. See, John Calvin is great, there's lots of people still lagging. Now, ideas do the same thing. So technology is really nothing more. Whatever your innovation is, whether it's a piece of technology or it's an idea, it's still an innovation. So ideas do exactly the same thing. And this is why John Calvin, Martin Luther, Reinhold Niebuhr are so important in this context. They are thought leaders, meaning they're early adopters. They're not innovators. The innovator, really and truly, the innovator on Western theology was Plato. And the integrator of Plato is Augustine. And Augustine is probably one of these early adopters. And so John Calvin, Luther, Augustine are all wrapped up in here. Now, they had a monopolistic control, so this chasm is a little skewed because they had the force of government, so they could compel adoption through here. So their ideas have held sway for the longest period of time, not because people adopted them, but because people were compelled to adopt them. Do you see the distinction I just made? Well, this is why Reinhold Niebuhr is actually important in this context. Because Reinhold Niebuhr was a very influential thinker, particularly in seminaries and in higher evolutions of theology. Now remember, what sparked this discussion this year was that question from Tauber on examining Calvinism. And why do Calvinist seminaries and Calvinist organizations lean left? And my point here is they don't lean left, they are left. And at the root, they have, their thought leaders have always been this way. And this is why Reinhold Niebuhr becomes relevant to us right here, right now. He was shaping ideas right around the 1930s, 1940s, somewhere in there. So right after the turn of the century, he became a primary thought leader in Christianity. Now, Niebuhr was a Kantian. I did one entire TANC series on Immanuel Kant. I think it's 2016. And is like the keeper of the lore for all things TANC, so he probably knows better than I do. But, so...
Yeah, 16.
16? So I address in detail Kantian doctrine, so I won't rehash it here. But the central theme of Kantian doctrine is man can't know who and what he is. He is metaphysically corrupted because he has no attachment to the true world. And as a result, his fundamental moral, the thing that makes him fundamentally moral is sacrifice. And altruistic sacrifice. Sacrifice for the sake of destruction as such. This led Niebuhr to be a true believing socialist. Niebuhr thought his mission to unravel America in the name of Christianity and social justice, which goes back to what we were just talking about. This man formally believed America had to be undone because it stood in the way of true justice and true humanity. Now, it's very hard for Americans who accept the Enlightenment ideas that created America to grasp Niebuhr's hatred for America. The single most prosperous nation ever in the history of the world, and the scorn he held for America's citizens whose achievements set the standard for innovation and relieved human suffering more than any other people ever. Niebuhr had a couple of books that he's very well known for. One of them is The Irony of American History. Unfortunately, this book is entirely misnamed. It has nothing to do with American irony, but is rather a tour de force in Niebuhr's tortured, nagging, self-righteous cynicism against American greatness. He resented American greatness for the sake of hating American greatness. And he did it because he was contemptuous in his book, Moral Man in Immoral Society, is a contemptuous treatise on how to offer Christians a justification to use government force to eradicate private property. Notice his moral premise goes hand in hand with government force. Remember back when I discussed the basics of philosophy and the progression and the relationship between ethics and political action. Now, the problem is that most people, if they paid attention at all to Niebuhr's arguments, he circles around kind of like a wolf circling its prey. He is subtle and cautious, but if you're not paying attention, you will not notice that he is getting closer and closer to his central thesis. Man's inexorable selfishness is the heart of injustice. So the fact that you as an individual produce for yourself is the original sin of human existence. His drive for private property his drive for the eradication of private property is his ultimate goal. Therefore, man needs to be forced into moral action. And here's the why and the wherefore of Al Mohler's article. The Mandela mythos is merely an opportunity to affirm some insidious premise. Christians need to wake up and smell the sacrifice. When preachers thump the pulpit insisting that the American existence is morally equivalent to the greatest thugs and dictatorships on the planet, you know they are fundamentally evil and corrupt. They want to pretend that they are paragons of virtue, but it's actually an ugly, ugly fraud. You must understand the evil underneath their vile hearts. By turning individuality into selfishness, by turning individuality into selfish exploitation, and single-handedly destroying virtue, by destroying virtue as such, summarily validates the likes of Joseph Stalin. If Joseph Stalin can wipe out tens of thousands of people, and my selfishness is not fundamentally any different, my refusal to feed the hungry is not really fundamentally, morally any different than Joseph Stalin's actions, I now, remember what I said back at my Web of Tyranny, the abolition of ambition? When you basically reduce individuals to cogs in the collective conformity wheel, they have no choice but to facilitate and advance the utopian dream. That's equally moral to Joseph Stalin wiping people out in pursuit of the utopian dream. This kind of moral equivalency sets up a disastrous moral standard. Or maybe it should be said that Joseph Stalin was morally complex, which is exactly what Al Mohler said about Mandela. Mandela the Marxist, Mandela the terrorist. The terrorist who was really nothing more, not really any different than the terrorist George Washington. The logic here sets up the premise that any political resistance is just moral complexity.
Yeah, the quotation by Mohler I remember most vividly in that article that you wrote on is Al Mohler saying, one man's terrorist is another man's patriot.
Correct, that is right.
Comparing Nelson Mandela to George Washington.
Correct, that is exactly
and
right.
The moral equivalence thereof.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And now watch how he justifies what this means. I just think this is just vile. Man's natural impulse makes egoism inescapable, and his egoism demands government to enforce social cohesion. Ergo, someone who makes the hard decision on how to do the greatest good, these men are historically necessary. They do the hard thing. They do the immoral thing to produce the greatest collective morality. And besides, who are we to judge? We're all just sinners. We all inhabit a fallen world. Remember, as I told you, you'd hear this again. Fallen world, that's like Al Mohler's trump card. It would say, we're in the fallen world, the fallen world, the fallen world. We're all just sinners. Will it not be God who judges us in the final analysis? God alone can save us from ourselves. There is no salvation here and now. Man is doomed to live an ugly history of sinners committing sin against other sinners. And this is exactly what Al was saying in his 2013 article. I'm paraphrasing what he meant. Who can really judge Nelson Mandela? He was a great man because he ended apartheid. Never mind his Marxism, never mind his brutality, never mind the result in South Africa was counter-racism. You, dear Christian, need to see that even our greatest men are morally complicated. So who can really judge their evil? One man's freedom is another man's terrorist. You ever wonder how neo-Calvinist preachers can speak sagely of the Christian doctrine of the equality of all men and ignore the historical reality that Calvinist Christianity has been at the forefront of slavery and political inequality since its inception? You ever wonder how Martin Luther's Heidelberg Disputation is held up as orthodoxy, but preachers ignore with impunity Luther's on Jews and their lies? You ever wonder why, with 100% consistency, the new Calvinist leadership has sided with leaders doing all manner of evil? Here's the answer. This is what Al Mohler said. I'll let you read.
I wonder, would he say the same thing about Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, well,
Adolf
2
Hitler
plus 2
historically
equals
necessary?
4.
Great.
Was Adolf Hitler historically necessary?
Great question. So people, if they can't see this, let me read it for them so they can hear it. So this is what Al Mohler said in his article in 2013. And yet, when we look at his legacy in terms of the overthrow of apartheid, we recall the fact that Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the most influential theologians in America at the middle of the 20th century, argued that there are times in which certain men, certain historical figures appear to be historically necessary, even if they are far from historically perfect. That seems so often to be the case in a fallen world. In a sinful world, in a world in which every dimension is marked by sin, the most effective political leaders are those who have the strongest convictions. But often those strong convictions and ambitions are met by somewhat less than stellar character. Think of what this really means. This should fill you with terror. In other words, because the moral outcome was correct, the means are actually
It's pragmatism.
absolute pragmatism. When I read this article in 2013, I was absolutely beside myself, which is of course why I gave it a almost 8,000 word evaluation. But this kind of pragmatism is what leads the church to side almost 100% of the time, if not 100% of the time, with some of the greatest villains on the planet.
Yeah, it's almost as chilling as Mike Huckabee saying that man's law is not above God's law.
Right.
That should make chills run up your spine.
Well, and that's his way of articulating on some level the two kingdoms doctrine.
Right. Right.
Over and over and over. These thugs here, over and over and over. These thugs here, over and over and over. Why? These men fancy that they are historically necessary. They also fancy that these men might be historically necessary. Now, okay, so if you actually hold them down about Joseph Stalin and maybe, what's that, Mao right there, they might get a little twitchy. But at the end of the day, they believe the outcome is correct. They believe these men of questionable morality, questionable ethics. Maybe we don't like it, but at the end of the day, was the outcome correct? Since man only has a choice of evils, man needs someone to enforce the right actions for the right outcome. Humanity needs historically necessary men. The men who will do the hard thing, even the immoral thing, for the greatest good of humanity. As long as the man in question is historically necessary, it does not matter that he stuffs people in ovens or sends them to gas chambers.
No, wait a minute. What are you reading right there?
I wrote this.
Oh, okay. All right.
Who among us is without sin? Those tenaciously committed to fixing America's social injustice must be forgiven their moral complexity, because that moral complexity justifies the means and the collateral damage and the byproduct of a sinful world. When the blood starts flowing here in America, this logic will be used by the leftist political church movement. to justify what happens next.
So Hitler was an evil man, he was just morally complex.
Right. Right. And the only thing, actually, in most instances, I find this, the Hitler thing, and everybody's like, oh my God, he's Hitler. I know it's bad argumentation, but the thing that most people reject in the Hitler issue is they don't like the fact that he wiped out like a populace, like one ethnic group. We're really bothered by the notion of ethnic cleansing, but the thing that people universally ignore is that he was a socialist. He wasn't fundamentally, his political outcome was effectively the exact same as Stalin's and Pol Pot's and Mao. Socialism, hardcore communism, its own variation, whatever, national socialism, which was basically a nation of socialists. So the thing that people really fuss over is the fact that he stuck a given ethnic group into ovens. But if you actually pin him down on Joseph Stalin, he killed way, way, way more people, but it wasn't an ethnic cleansing, so whatever. So yeah, Hitler could be morally complex.
And that's why he was supported by the church during World War II.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. That was exactly why. They did exactly the same thing. They made exactly the same argument. Mm-hmm. This is the two kingdoms argument in National Socialist Germany was exactly what made them think that Adolf Hitler was basically God's appointed messenger on the planet to do his will for his perfect kingdom, the Third Reich, the 1,000-year reign. And oh, by the way, the church bought into that lock, stock, and barrel. And it wasn't just a few aberrant few. It was the bulk of the country. Why? Because they accepted the fundamental premise advocated initially by the thought leader, Martin Luther, that it was the Jews who were responsible for hoarding all this wealth, and oh, by the way, we should get rid of the Jews so we can have money.
Well, even the Catholics got into better than mine.
Right. Oh, yeah.
With who?
With Hitler. It was the Lutheran Church at first, in Germany, but it wasn't long before the Catholics got on board, too.
Well, the challenge that they had, actually, Hitler was smart enough to realize that Catholics were Catholic first and German second. So he could not appeal to their national identity. The Lutherans, by contrast, were exactly the opposite. They were German first and Lutheran by identity, because Luther was a German. And so he could play on their nationalistic bent and bring them along for the ride for National Socialism. But Catholics already had an identity that transcended borders, and so Hitler deliberately, he actually talks about this at length in Mein Kampf. It was a strategic plan. Now eventually, the socialist Marxist tendencies of the Catholic Church led them to agree with Hitler, but at the end of the day, they still didn't have a centralized identity, and that's what prevented them from getting on the National Socialist bandwagon, the same as the Lutherans did. That's all I got, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.